In the winter of 1935, a package arrived at the 48th Street offices of the Chicago outfit. No return address, no note, just 8 fedoras, carefully folded, each still holding the shape of the man who'd worn it. Blood had dried in the silk bands. One hat had a bullet hole clean through the crown. The secretary who opened it didn't scream. She'd worked for the outfit long enough to understand what silence meant in their world. She walked the package directly to Frank Nitti's office on the 3rd floor, set it on his desk without a word, and left. Nitti stared at those hats for 11 minutes. Witnesses later reported he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't reach for his usual morning cigar. He recognized every single one. The gray Borsalino had belonged to Tony, the Blade Accardo's cousin. The black Stetson was Vincent Drucci's nephew's favorite. The brown derby with the feather, that was Carlo Mancini's, a soldado who'd served the outfit since he was 16 years old. 8 men had left Chicago 3 weeks earlier. Al Capone himself had sent them. The assignment was simple, almost casual. Go to Harlem, collect on a debt, remind a certain someone that Chicago's reach extended far beyond the Midwest. They were experienced men, connected men, the kind who didn't make mistakes. But they never came back. And now their hats sat on Frank Nitti's desk, arranged in a perfect line, like headstones in a cemetery that didn't exist. The man who'd sent them the message wasn't a government agent. He wasn't a rival mob boss from New York's 5 families. He wasn't even Italian. He was a black man from South Carolina who'd transformed Harlem into something the Chicago outfit had never seen before, a kingdom within a kingdom, where the rules were different, where power moved through different channels, where 8 armed enforcers could disappear without a single witness coming forward, without a single body ever being found. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, but everyone called him Bumpy. What happened in those 3 weeks between the men's departure and the arrival of those hats would become one of the most debated events in organized crime history. It was a story that would force Al Capone, a man who'd ordered hundreds of executions, who'd survived gang wars and federal investigations, who'd built an empire on violence and intimidation, to reassess everything he thought he knew about power. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't just kill those men. Anyone could kill. What he did was far more sophisticated, far more terrifying. He made them vanish in a city of 2 million people in broad daylight, without leaving a single piece of evidence that would hold up in court. He sent a message that couldn't be ignored, but couldn't be answered. He drew a line that even Al Capone, at the height of his power, chose not to cross. This is the story of how the sharecropper's grandson from South Carolina became the one man in America that the Chicago outfit feared. This is the story of what happened when the nation's most powerful criminal organization learned that Harlem wasn't just another territory to be conquered. And this is the story of 8 hats that told a truth more powerful than any threat, any gun, any amount of money could convey. The war that never happened changed everything. To understand what happened in 1935, you have to understand what Harlem was and what Chicago thought it could be. By the mid-1930s, Al Capone's Chicago outfit controlled the most profitable criminal empire in American history. Conservative estimates put their annual revenue at $105 million, more than $2.3 billion in today's money. They ran 161 speakeasies, controlled the distribution of alcohol across 6 states, operated gambling houses, brothels, and protection rackets that touched nearly every business in Chicago. They had judges on payroll, police captains in their pocket, and politicians who took their calls before they took calls from the mayor. Capone himself had become a cultural phenomenon. Newspapers called him public enemy number 1. Hollywood made movies about him while he was still active. When he attended the opera or a baseball game, crowds gathered to catch a glimpse. He'd survived at least 12 assassination attempts, most notably the 1926 drive-by, where 89 bullets were fired at his headquarters, and he walked away without a scratch. The man seemed untouchable, invincible, and he knew it. In September 1934, Capone had been released from federal custody on a technicality, a clerical error in his tax evasion case that his lawyers exploited masterfully. He returned to Chicago to find his organization stronger than ever, running smoothly under Frank Nitti's management. But Capone wanted more. He'd always wanted more. His attention turned east to Harlem. The neighborhood had exploded during the Great Migration. Between 1920 and 1930, Harlem's black population had increased by 115%. What had been a predominantly white, middle-class neighborhood had transformed into the cultural and economic heart of Black America. The Harlem Renaissance brought writers, musicians, artists, and intellectuals, but also brought money. Lots of money. And where there was money, there was opportunity for men like Al Capone. The problem was Bumpy Johnson. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson had arrived in Harlem in 1919, a 15-year-old kid from Margaret, South Carolina, with nothing but the clothes he was wearing and a reputation for fighting that had followed him out of the South. His parents had sent him north to live with an older sister after he'd beaten a white man so badly that the local sheriff had suggested he disappear before things got complicated. Harlem in 1919 was lawless. Italian mobs controlled most of the gambling and prostitution. Irish gangs ran protection rackets. The police didn't patrol black neighborhoods with any seriousness. They only showed up after someone was already dead. Young black men had two choices: work for pennies and jobs that would never lead anywhere, or work for the mobs that controlled the neighborhood. Bumpy chose a third option. He started taking what he wanted and daring anyone to stop him. By 1922, he was running numbers for Stephanie St. Clair, the woman known as Queenie, a black immigrant from Martinique who'd built her own gambling operation in defiance of the Italian mobs. She saw something in Bumpy that others didn't. Not just muscle, but intelligence, strategy, the ability to think 3 moves ahead. St. Clair became his mentor. She taught him that power wasn't just about violence. It was about information, about relationships, about understanding what people wanted and what they feared. She taught him that in Harlem, where the police couldn't be trusted and the legal system had no interest in justice, a different kind of order had to be established. By 1930, Bumpy had taken over operations from St. Clair and expanded them dramatically. He controlled the numbers racket across a 40-block territory. He ran protection for black-owned businesses, but unlike the Italian mobs, he actually provided protection. His men stopped robberies, prevented shakedowns from corrupt cops, mediated disputes. He became a banker for people who couldn't get loans from white institutions. He paid for funerals, covered medical bills, made sure families didn't go hungry when breadwinners were arrested or killed. The people of Harlem didn't fear Bumpy Johnson. They respected him, and that made all the difference. When the Italian mobs tried to muscle in on his territory, they found themselves fighting not just Bumpy's organization, but the entire community. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence vanished. Their usual tactics, intimidation, violence, buying off officials, didn't work the same way in Harlem. It was a kingdom with its own rules, its own code, its own definition of loyalty. By 1934, Bumpy controlled an estimated $3 million in annual revenue from numbers, gambling, of various other enterprises. Not on the scale of the Chicago outfit, certainly, but in his territory, he was absolute. He employed over 400 people directly and influenced the livelihoods of thousands more. He had informants in the police department, relationships with politicians in Tammany Hall, and a network of loyal soldiers who would die before betraying him. Al Capone looked at Harlem's potential revenue and saw an opportunity. He looked at Bumpy Johnson and saw an obstacle. One black man, no matter how connected, who could be removed. It was a fundamental miscalculation. Frank Nitti had warned him. Harlem ain't like other territories, he'd said during a meeting in August 1934. The people there, they're different. They protect their own. Capone had laughed. Actually laughed. They're making millions in a neighborhood we could control, he'd replied. And you're telling me one colored bootlegger is going to stop the Chicago outfit? The room had gone quiet. No one contradicted Capone when he'd made up his mind. But Nitti had been right. And by the winter of 1935, everyone in that room would understand just how right he'd been. They left Chicago on January 7th, 1935, at 6:15 in the evening. 8 men, 3 cars, enough weapons to start a small war. Tony Accardo, not the famous Tony joke batters Accardo, but his cousin, a man who'd made his bones during the beer wars of the 1920s, led the group. At 32, he was a seasoned enforcer with a reputation for efficiency. He'd personally overseen the collection of debts across Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. He didn't leave witnesses, and he didn't leave loose ends. Vincent Drucci Jr., nephew of the late Vincent the Schemer Drucci, was the second in command. 28 years old, hungry to prove himself worthy of his uncle's legacy. He carried a .45 automatic and a straight razor that had belonged to his uncle. Carlo Mancini, the quiet one, had been with the outfit since 1920. He was 41, married, father of 3. He ran a legitimate restaurant on the South Side as a front for money laundering. Reliable, professional, the kind of man you sent when you wanted the job done without drama. The other 5 were younger, eager, violent men whose names would later be difficult to confirm. Records were deliberately destroyed. Families denied they'd ever existed. But witnesses remembered them. 2 Irish brothers from Bridgeport, a Sicilian immigrant who barely spoke English, and 2 former boxers who'd found more profitable work breaking bones for the outfit. Their instructions were clear. Go to Harlem, find Bumpy Johnson, deliver Capone's message. The Chicago outfit wanted 40% of Harlem's numbers racket. In exchange, they'd provide protection, political connections, and access to markets beyond New York. It was a generous offer, really, more generous than the outfit usually made. If Johnson refused, they were to make an example of him. Publicly, violently, in a way that would make every other independent operator from Boston to Miami understand what happened when you rejected Chicago's partnership. They never expected Johnson to be waiting for them. The 8 men arrived in New York on January 9th. They checked into the Teresa Hotel on 125th Street and 7th Avenue. Harlem's finest, the only hotel in the neighborhood that accepted black guests and white guests equally. The outfit had reserved rooms under false names. They paid in cash. They didn't cause trouble. For 2 days, they scouted. They identified Johnson's known locations: his headquarters above a pharmacy on Lenox Avenue, the 3 nightclubs where he collected money, the apartment building where he supposedly lived. They watched his movements, noted his security, counted his men. On the 3rd day, Tony Accardo made the approach. He walked into the pharmacy on Lenox Avenue at 2 p.m., alone and unarmed as a sign of good faith. He asked to speak with Mr. Johnson about a business opportunity. The clerk, a middle-aged black woman who didn't look up from her newspaper, told him to wait. 37 minutes later, 2 of Bumpy's men escorted Accardo upstairs. What happened in that meeting, we know only from second-hand accounts. Accardo emerged 22 minutes later, pale, walking quickly to the waiting car. His hands were shaking. His cousin asked him what Johnson had said. According to a later report from an informant who claimed to be in the car, Accardo replied, "He already knew we were coming. He knew our names. He knew which hotel we were staying at, which rooms. He knew we landed at Pennsylvania Station on the 6:15 train. He knew everything." The cousin asked what Johnson's answer was. He said Chicago could have 40% of Harlem when Al Capone personally came to collect it. Then Accardo said something else, something that wouldn't make sense until later. He said to enjoy our stay in New York. He said the city could be dangerous for tourists who didn't know where they were welcome. That night, the 8 men held a meeting in Accardo's hotel room. According to a maid who later spoke to police and later recanted her statement, she heard arguing. Someone wanted to leave immediately. Someone else called them cowards. One man said they should hit Johnson that night, teach him respect, show him that Chicago wasn't afraid. They decided to stay. They decided to make an example. It was the last decision they ever made. On January 12, 1935, at approximately 9:30 a.m., all 8 men left the Teresa Hotel together. The hotel clerk remembered because they didn't take their luggage. They said they'd be back for lunch. They were never seen alive again. What happened over the next 72 hours remains one of the most mysterious events in organized crime history. No bodies were ever found. No witnesses ever came forward. No crime scenes were ever discovered. 8 armed, dangerous men vanished from the streets of Harlem as completely as if they'd never existed. But pieces of the story emerged over time, from whispers and implications, from what people didn't say as much as what they did. The outfit had men watching the hotel. When the 8 didn't return by evening, those watchers started asking questions. They went to the pharmacy on Lenox Avenue. Closed. They went to the nightclubs where Johnson collected money. No one had seen him. They went to the police precinct on 135th Street, thinking maybe there'd been arrests. The desk sergeant, a man named Patrick O'Malley who'd been on the force for 19 years, looked at them with an expression one witness later described as pity mixed with contempt. He told them no arrests had been made. He suggested they check the hospitals. He suggested they check the morgue. He suggested they go back to Chicago. Then he said something that the outfit messenger would remember for the rest of his life. Harlem takes care of its own problems. Always has. The Chicago men searched for 3 more days. They questioned bartenders, shop owners, street hustlers, prostitutes. Everyone gave them the same response: polite ignorance. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. The city had swallowed 8 men without leaving a trace. On January 18th, Frank Nitti received a phone call from his men in New York. They wanted permission to come home. They'd done everything they could. The men were gone. Nitti told them to wait. He sent 10 more men, these ones with instructions to tear Harlem apart if necessary. Find the bodies. Find witnesses. Find something. Those 10 men arrived in New York on January 20th. They lasted 4 days before they, too, called Nitti and begged to leave. One of them later told a confidant that Harlem felt like enemy territory during a war. Every corner they turned, they felt watched. Every conversation, they had seemed to echo back to Johnson's people. Their hotel rooms were broken into. Nothing stolen, just rearranged. A message that nowhere was safe. One man found a single bullet on his pillow with a note. This one has your name on it. The next one won't come with a warning. Nitti pulled them out. He understood what Al Capone refused to accept. They'd lost. But they didn't know how badly until the hats arrived. The package was postmarked January 22nd from New York City. No fingerprints. No DNA evidence. Forensics in 1935 weren't sophisticated enough for that. Just 8 hats, each one a tombstone, each one a message. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just killed those men. He'd erased them, and then he'd sent proof of what he'd done in a way that couldn't be traced, couldn't be prosecuted, couldn't be answered with traditional violence. Because what was the outfit going to do? Report it to the police? Claim that their men had been murdered while attempting to extort a Harlem numbers runner? Launch an open war against a man who controlled an entire neighborhood, who could make people disappear without consequences, who just demonstrated that Chicago's reputation meant nothing in his territory. If you're still watching this, you're learning about one of the most perfectly executed power moves in criminal history. But the question everyone in the underworld was asking in 1935 was the same question you might be asking now. How did Bumpy Johnson actually do it? How did one man make 8 trained killers vanish? The answer involved a level of community organization, strategic brilliance, and cold calculation that even the Chicago outfit had to respect. And we're going to explore exactly how he pulled it off. But first, understand this. The hats were just the beginning of Capone's humiliation. The truth about what happened to those 8 men came out in pieces over the next 3 decades, whispered in pool halls, hinted at in newspaper obituaries, confirmed by deathbed confessions and FBI wiretaps that wouldn't be declassified until the 1970s. Bumpy Johnson didn't kill them personally. He didn't need to. What he'd built in Harlem was something the Italian mobs had never seen before, a truly communal criminal organization. While the Chicago outfit operated through fear and bribery, Johnson operated through reciprocity and respect. He'd spent 15 years making himself indispensable to the community. And when those 8 men arrived threatening that community's stability, the community responded. According to a 1938 FBI report that would later be partially declassified, Johnson had informants in at least 7 different agencies and organizations throughout New York City. He knew about the outfit's plans weeks before the men left Chicago. A federal agent in the Treasury Department, never identified, had tipped him off. The agent owed Johnson a favor. Johnson had provided information that helped solve a different case, one involving a white gang that had been robbing black-owned businesses. Johnson knew the men's names, their arrival time, their hotel, their mission, before they even bought their train tickets. So he prepared. On January 12th, when the 8 men left the Teresa Hotel, they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap that involved dozens of people and multiple stages. But it didn't look like a trap. It never does when it's done correctly. The men split up shortly after leaving the hotel. According to a witness who later spoke to a Harlem newspaper under condition of anonymity, they divided into 3 groups. Tony Accardo and 2 others went to survey one of Johnson's gambling operations. Vincent Drucci Jr. and 2 men went to scope out the nightclub where Johnson allegedly held court most evenings. Carlo Mancini and the remaining 2 decided to grab breakfast and plan the evening's confrontation. Each group was followed. Not obviously, not threateningly, just watched. Accardo's group made it 4 blocks before they were approached by a Harlem police officer, James Walker, badge number 2847, an officer who'd grown up in the neighborhood and who'd received more than a few favors from Johnson's organization. Walker asked for identification. "Routine check," he said. The men complied. He walked away, but he confirmed their identities and radioed their location. Drucci's group stopped at a newsstand to buy cigarettes. The vendor, Samuel Gross, age 56, who ran the stand for 30 years and whose daughter's medical bills had been paid by Johnson when she'd gotten tuberculosis, made small talk. Asked where they were from. They said Chicago. Gross mentioned his cousin in Chicago. Asked what neighborhood. They mentioned the South Side. 20 seconds of conversation that told Gross exactly who these men were and what they represented. Mancini's group entered a diner on 132nd Street. The waitress who served them, Ella Thompson, 24, whose brother was one of Johnson's soldiers, noticed their weapons, noticed their accents, noticed how they sat with their backs to the wall, and scanned everyone who entered up EY noon. Johnson knew the location of all 8 men and their current state of mind. Confident, armed, aggressive. What happened next is where accounts diverge. Some say the men were lured to different locations with promises of meetings with Johnson. Others say they were ambushed in broad daylight. The most credible version, pieced together from multiple sources, is far more subtle. Each group received a message, delivered by different people through different channels, but with the same basic information. Johnson wanted to negotiate. He was willing to discuss terms, but he wanted to meet on neutral ground, at locations where both sides could feel safe. Accardo's group was told to meet at a warehouse in the Bronx, technically outside Johnson's territory. Drucci's group was sent to a boxing gym in Queens, owned by a former heavyweight contender who supposedly had no mob connections. Mancini's group was directed to a social club in Lower Harlem, in a building that housed mostly Italian families. None of these locations were neutral. The warehouse in the Bronx was owned by a Puerto Rican gang that had business arrangements with Johnson. When Accardo and his men arrived, they were met by 10 armed men who'd been waiting for hours. No shots were fired. No violence was necessary. They were simply outnumbered, disarmed, and transported. The boxing gym in Queens was owned by a man who owed Johnson his life. Johnson had intervened when a different gang had tried to burn down the gym over a gambling debt. Drucci's group walked in expecting a meeting and found themselves surrounded. Mancini's group was the most interesting. They were met at the social club by three older Italian men who claimed to be mediators, respected members of the community who wanted to prevent bloodshed. They offered wine. They offered food. They talked for 90 minutes about the importance of respect, about the traditions of their profession, about the fact that Harlem had always been a place where different people found ways to coexist. And then those three men, later identified as members of Harlem-based Italian crew that had made peace with Johnson years earlier, pulled their own guns and told Mancini he'd been a fool to trust anyone in this neighborhood. By 6 p.m. on January 12th, all 8 Chicago men were in Johnson's custody. Not a single shot had been fired. Not a single witness had seen anything that looked like a crime. What happened to them over the next 3 days is the darkest part of this story. There are things we know for certain, and things we can only infer from evidence that emerged much later. We know the 8 men were held in at least 3 different locations across Harlem and the Bronx. We know they were questioned. We know Johnson personally spoke with at least some of them. And we know that by January 15th, all 8 were dead. What we don't know, what no witness would ever confirm, what no evidence would ever prove, is exactly how they died or where they were buried. A detective named William Loughran investigated the disappearance in 1936, after pressure from Chicago forced the NYPD to at least pretend they were looking into it. His report, which remained sealed until 1989, contains a fascinating paragraph. Informants within the community suggest that the men were given a choice: leave New York immediately and never return, or face consequences. Whether they refused this offer or whether such an offer was ever genuine remains unclear. What is clear is that their bodies, if they still exist, were disposed of with a level of sophistication suggesting medical knowledge, access to industrial equipment, and complete cooperation from multiple individuals across several locations. The report continues. One informant, speaking under condition of complete anonymity, suggested the bodies were processed through a Bronx slaughterhouse, mixed with animal remains, and disposed of through standard rendering procedures. Another claimed they were buried in the foundation of a building under construction in Harlem. A third stated they were weighted and dropped into the East River from 3 different locations. All 3 informants agreed on one detail. The community knew what had happened and considered it justified. Johnson himself never spoke about it. Not to police, not to rivals, not even to his closest associates. But he did speak about the principle behind it. In a 1962 interview with a Harlem journalist, one of the few interviews he ever gave, Johnson was asked about his reputation for making problems disappear. He responded, "In Harlem, we handle things internally. We don't involve outside authorities. We don't create spectacles. When someone threatens our community, we remove that threat quietly and completely. That's not cruelty. That's protection." The interviewer asked if he was referring to the Chicago incident. Johnson smiled. "I'm referring to the way we've always done things. The way we always will." The hats that arrived at Frank Nitti's office were cleaned, pressed, and carefully packaged. Each hat had been identified. Johnson's people had gone through the men's hotel rooms, matched the hats to their owners, ensured there would be no confusion about what was being communicated. The message wasn't, "I killed your men." The message was, "I can make your men disappear without leaving evidence, without creating witnesses, without giving you anything you can use against me. I can hit you in ways you can't respond to, and I can do it again whenever I choose." It was psychological warfare at its finest. When Al Capone was shown the hats, he reportedly went silent for several minutes. Then he asked Nitti a question: "How many of our men are still in New York?" Nitti told him, "None. They'd all been pulled back." Capone asked, "What are our options?" Nitti gave him the analysis. They could send more men, but those men would likely disappear too. They could try to bomb Johnson's operations, but they didn't know all his locations, and such an attack would create too much heat with the NYPD. They could try to have him arrested, but Johnson had better police connections than they did in New York. They could try to negotiate, but from a position of weakness now. Or they could let it go. Capone made his decision on January 28, 1935. The Chicago outfit would stay out of Harlem. They would respect Johnson's territory. They would consider the matter closed. It was the first time in years that Al Capone had backed down from anyone. Word spread through the underworld like fire through dry grass. The man who defeated the North Side Gang, who'd orchestrated the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, who'd built the most powerful criminal organization in America, had been beaten by a black numbers runner from South Carolina. Johnson's reputation transformed overnight. He wasn't just a Harlem boss anymore. He was a legitimate power, someone who commanded respect from the biggest players in organized crime. The consequences of January 1935 rippled through both organizations for years. In Chicago, the incident became something that was never discussed openly, but was understood by everyone. Frank Nitti maintained control of the outfit, and when Al Capone was finally convicted for tax evasion in 1936, for real this time, no technicalities, the Harlem humiliation became part of his legacy. The untouchable gangster had been touched. The invincible boss had retreated. For Bumpy Johnson, the victory established his position not just in Harlem, but in the larger ecosystem of American organized crime. The Italian mobs in New York, the Luciano family, the Genovese family, all five of what would become the Five Families, approached him not as a subordinate, but as a peer. They proposed partnerships instead of demanding tribute. They respected his borders. Between 1935 and 1952, when Johnson was finally imprisoned on conspiracy charges, his organization grew to control an estimated $15 million in annual revenue. He expanded beyond numbers into legitimate businesses, real estate, restaurants, laundries, and taxi companies. He became a political power broker, helping to elect the first black city council members in Harlem. He mediated disputes between other gangs, preventing wars that would have destroyed the neighborhood. But he never forgot the lesson of those 8 hats. Power isn't about how much violence you can inflict. It's about how completely you can control the narrative, how thoroughly you can protect your territory, how effectively you can make your enemies understand that fighting you costs more than it could ever gain them. The families of the 8 men who disappeared received different stories. Some were told their relatives died in car accidents. Others heard about sudden illnesses. A few were told the truth, or a version of it, that their sons, brothers, husbands had gone to New York on outfit business and had encountered resistance they couldn't overcome. None of the families received the bodies. That absence haunted them. Carlo Mancini's wife, Maria, spent 17 years searching for information about what happened to her husband. She hired private investigators, contacted police departments, wrote letters to politicians. In 1952, she received an anonymous letter postmarked from Harlem. It contained a single sentence: "Your husband died quickly and without suffering. He was buried with respect. Let him rest." She never knew if it was true. She never knew who sent it. But according to her daughter, who spoke about it in a 1987 oral history project, Maria kept that letter until the day she died. Some truth, even uncertain truth, was better than endless questions. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack while having breakfast at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. He was 62 years old. Thousands of people attended his funeral. The service was held at Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of Harlem's most prominent institutions. Politicians, civil rights leaders, entertainers, and yes, representatives from various criminal organizations all came to pay their respects. Among the flowers sent to the funeral were 8 bouquets, each with a simple card. From Chicago, with respect. No name, no explanation, but everyone who knew the story understood what it meant. 3 decades later, the outfit was still acknowledging what had happened in 1935, still remembering the man who'd taught them that Harlem was not a territory to be conquered. The legend of the 8 hats became one of those stories that gets told in different ways, depending on who's telling it. Some versions make it more violent, with gunfights and torture. Some versions make it more mysterious, suggesting the men are still alive somewhere, in witness protection or hiding under new identities. Some versions deny it happened at all, claiming it's an urban legend that grew from smaller incidents. But the truth, as much as we can reconstruct it from historical records, witness testimonies, FBI files, and the patterns of behavior that followed, is actually more impressive than the legends. Bumpy Johnson orchestrated the capture, interrogation, and execution of 8 professional killers without creating a single piece of prosecutable evidence. He did it through community organization, strategic intelligence gathering, and a network of loyal supporters who understood that their safety depended on his continued authority. He sent a message to the most powerful criminal organization in America that was impossible to misunderstand and impossible to answer. And he did it all without ever making the mistake that Al Capone made repeatedly, seeking publicity, demanding recognition, needing the world to know how powerful he was. Johnson understood something that Capone never did. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. Real power operates in the spaces between what's known and what's proven. Real power makes its point once definitively, and then lets silence carry the message forward. When historians look back at American organized crime in the 1930s, they typically focus on Capone, Luciano, Schultz, the famous names, the Italian and Irish bosses who dominated the headlines. But among those who study the actual power dynamics, the strategic calculations, the moments when one organization decisively defeated another, January 1935 stands out. It was the month when Harlem stopped being a target and became a kingdom. When Bumpy Johnson stopped being a local boss and became a legend. When 8 men left Chicago carrying Al Capone's authority, and only their hats came home. The concrete details of that story, the exact locations, the specific methods, the precise sequence of events, will probably never be fully known. Too much time has passed. Too many witnesses have died. Too many records were deliberately destroyed or never created in the first place. But the truth that matters is preserved in what happened afterward. The Chicago outfit never moved against Harlem again. Other criminal organizations learned to negotiate with Johnson rather than threaten him. The community he protected flourished for decades, creating the cultural and economic foundation that would fuel the civil rights movement and reshape American society. And somewhere in Harlem, in the buildings and streets that witnessed those 3 days in January 1935, people still remember the story. Still tell it to younger generations as a lesson about intelligence overcoming brute force, about community solidarity defeating outside aggression, about a man who turned the greatest criminal organization in America away from his doorstep without firing a shot that could be traced. 8 Hats came home to Chicago in the winter of 1935. They told a story that words never could. They proved that Al Capone's laugh, his confidence, his assumption of inevitable victory had been premature, and they established a truth that the underworld never forgot. There are some territories, some men, some communities that cannot be conquered. They can only be respected. Bumpy Johnson built one of those kingdoms, and the 8 Hats that came home to Chicago were the deed to that kingdom, written in a language that every criminal in America understood perfectly. The war that never happened changed everything. And the men who disappeared into Harlem silence became the foundation of a legend that outlived everyone who witnessed it.